Thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. Thank you all for taking some of your time out of your day for this webinar. We're here for the Reserve Studies 101 seminar designed to go over the foundation of the reserve study, the reserve component list. My name is Robert Nordlund, and I've been preparing reserve studies for the past 25 years. I've learned that you can have the most accurate pricing estimates, the best useful life and remaining useful life estimates, and the most sophisticated funding plans, but if you aren't working with the right components, all your accuracy and sophistication in all the other areas is wasted. By signing up for this webinar today, I expect you have questions about how we assemble the reserve component list. I'm going to explain exactly how we do that today, and in the process help you save time during the budget preparation process by being more familiar with your reserve study, get maximum value from your reserve study, because most of you will pay to have a reserve study created, and we want you to get your money's worth by getting the accurate results you need and knowing how to use those results. And finally, we want to help you make better decisions leading to more successful communities. Since this seminar is designed for your benefit, if now or at any time you have a specific question, please type it into the questions section of your dialog box, which would look like this and appear at the right of your screen. And in addition, I like speaking to a live audience, so to get some periodic feedback, I'll ask for you to, at a couple times during the program, raise your hands in response to a point I've made. You'll see that hands raised icon in the same control panel or a dialog box area. Let's test that right now. Give me a hands raised to show me you're with me and following along. Hands raised, everybody. Just another second. Come on, everyone. Hands raised. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to click on hands down. Thank you very much. Many people are anxious about what a reserve study is and does, treating it like it's unfamiliar, dangerous, or radioactive. Well, we're going to change that today. It's a big help that National Reserve Study standards exist in place since 1998. The concepts I'll be explaining today are not just what we do here at Association Reserves. They are National Reserve Study standards. These standards provide us with consistent terminology to help with communication. Basic contents you can expect in a reserve study, like requiring a display of a minimum 20 years of projected income and expenditures. Minimum disclosures, like the fiscal year of the reserve study or the type of reserve study performed. And finally, a national credential for those who are in the reserve study preparation business. Every time I show some of these national standard concepts, you'll see this yellow NRSS star on your screen. That'll highlight that this is one of those key National Reserve Study standard concepts. These reserve study concepts apply to all types of associations. Nice new townhomes, high-rise associations, older associations, and fancy or resort associations. Specifically in today's session, you'll learn how to avoid surprises. We believe surprises should be minimized. A well-done reserve study will limit your exposure to surprises to those that are true emergencies, so you're not surprised by something that slowly deteriorated, often in plain sight, over the last 20 years. We're going to help avoid making mistakes due to missed components, components that should have appeared in your reserve study, but unfortunately didn't. We're going to help you avoid mistakes that appear when components appear both in the operating budget and the reserve budget, multiplying around, something we call double budgeting. And finally, we're going to help you see how a reserve component list can be created that is stable from year to year, making the annual update process smooth and giving your owners a consistent capital budget platform. Let's look at what I'm talking about. I'm a firm believer that you need to start with the end in mind, so here we go. What does a successful reserve planning experience look like? Well, it looks like property values that reach their peak, maintenance around the property that gets done when needed, projects that get done with competitive bids in the appropriate season of the year, and a sense of things running smoothly at the association, or peace. And conversely, what does failure look like? Looks like political, organizational, or financial trouble and turmoil. And this is often typified by long and stressful board meetings. Special assessments, threats of impending special assessments or actual or threatened lawsuits, projects not getting done when needed, something we call deferred maintenance, and finally lower property values. Since a place doesn't look sharp, and you need to ask yourself, why would a buyer pay top dollar to live here? Now, I hope none of these problems sound too familiar to you, but how do people get themselves into this situation? And more importantly, how do you stay out of this situation? It happens when you don't know what to do. But after this session, that won't be a problem, because you'll know how to assemble a reliable reserve component list. So what are we talking about? A lot of words on the screen here, basically summarizing that a reserve study is the art and science, and notice the difference between the two, of anticipating and preparing for the major common area repair and replacement needs of the association. So this begs the question, what are those major projects and how are they defined? Now, unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of time. The natural tendency for all things is to decay, so you've got to be proactive to fight against decay with a plan. That means you can't dawdle. You need to adjust your numbers and your plan every year in order to not fall behind, because those future expenses charge closer and closer each year. So with the stage set, let me get to the advertised webinar content. I'm going to walk you through the material today in this order, building one concept at a time so the subject is easy to digest. I'm familiar with it, but I'm expecting that it's new to you guys. So first on the agenda is deciding which components go into a reserve study. Just in case you're not sure what I'm talking about, this is what a simple reserve component list looks like. Useful life, UL is short for useful life. RUL is the abbreviation for remaining useful life, and cost is, of course, the current cost of the component. Now, because all the computations done in a reserve study are based on the components appearing in this list, it's very important to make sure you have the right components appearing in the reserve component list. The correct components defines the scope of the reserve study. And the useful life, remaining useful life, and replacement cost all define the schedule of the reserve study. So the question is, at your association, which components should and shouldn't appear in your reserve component list? Fortunately, we have a reliable national standards 4-part test to guide us in this area. There's no master list, no magic list to pick from that one company can claim is better or longer than another company's master checklist. A good and complete reserve component list is based on National Reserve Study Standard principles. And when the board, management, and reserve professional are all using the same national standard 4-part test, the result is a stable reserve component list where assets are not missed and don't appear both in the operating budget and the reserve budget. So, for a component to be appropriate for reserve funding, you need to answer yes to each of these 4 questions. Number 1, is it a common area maintenance responsibility? Not private property or owned or maintained by another entity. There we go. The second is that the component needs to have a limited useful life, not be something that is expected to last effectively forever. The third is that the remaining useful life needs to be predictable. If decay can't be predicted, then you can't put a number on it, and it becomes, by definition, a surprise. Because if you could put a number on it, you'd budget for it. But if you can't put a number on it, then it is something that you can't plan for through the reserve budget. And the fourth test is that it needs to be above a minimum cost of significance, typically something that otherwise you'd handle it through the ongoing operational budget. All the components in your reserve component list should have passed this four-part test. You can see that they're common area projects with a useful life, predictable remaining useful life, and with a significant, at least to this association, repair or replacement cost. Okay, I'm going to ask for hands raised. Everyone with me so far? Understand that selecting the reserve component list is part of a four-part test. Hands raised? Great. Okay, thanks all for following along. I'm going to go hands down here. Okay, with this four-part test, you can walk around your association and test what you see to determine if anything's appropriate for reserve funding. So let's look at a few specific examples. When I look at this photo, I see a number of components, or I should say possible components. Roofing, stucco painting, wood trim, maybe sidewalks, maybe asphalt if it's private. For each, I need to ask if the asset is a common area maintenance responsibility with a limited life, with a predictable remaining useful life, and above the threshold of significance. For example, at this association, the air conditioning condensers are private property, so they fail test number 1 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. This association has concrete underground parking. This surface is expected to last practically forever, so because it doesn't have a limited useful life, it fails test number 2 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. And in that same garage floor is a sump pump. A sump pump is a pump that moves water up from a very low catch pit at the low point in the garage and pumps it up to the street level drainage. Nobody that I met during my site inspection ever knew if it ran. They never heard it during rainy times or dry times. We all just observed that it was there, and they all reported that the garage never floods. So its use and age and remaining useful life are all indeterminate, so it fails test number 3 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. Now let's go up to the roof of that building. On this flat roof is a small top-story hallway ventilator fan. While you can see some rust on the housing, inside is just a simple motor, fan, and belt. The association fixes this ventilator as needed as a minor operational expense, so it fails test number 4 and shouldn't appear in the reserve component list. So that's the four-part test on a few simple components. Let's step up the difficulty and see how you apply it to a tougher situation. Here's a photo looking at the ceiling of an underground garage. This association has put sheet metal gutters under areas of the piping and ceiling because of leaks. Now follow along with me as I go through the four-part test. Is plumbing a common area maintenance responsibility? Yes. Does it have a useful life? Yes, as it has clearly deteriorated and failed. Does it have a predictable remaining useful life? Yes. In fact, I believe it probably hit 0 a few years ago when they put up the gutter. And finally, do you expect a repiping project like this to be above a minimum cost? Absolutely. I would expect a repiping project like this to be very expensive. So repiping the garage area is clearly appropriate for reserve designation. So now you know which components appear on the reserve component list, which don't, and why. You know how this list came together. The components need to pass a four-part test. It's not something that we compare against a magic checklist that defines what is and isn't in your reserve study. So the next question is, what information do we gather about each component? For every reserve component, in addition to a clear description of the project, for example, you don't just say fence, you should say fence replace or fence repaint. You always need to be clear on the matter. We need to collect the following information, something that's of a particular identifying manner. Typically this is quantity, but it could also mean serial number or size, like the BTU rating of a pool heater or horsepower of a pump. And then, of course, we estimate useful life, remaining useful life, also in years, and the current replacement cost. Now, note that the financial analysis portion of the reserve study will contain future costs, but those are projections made from the foundational current replacement costs that appear in the reserve component list. So let's come back to this example reserve component list. With quantity eliminated for space, you can see a clear description of the project. First is furniture replace, pool resurface, roof replace, goes on, and values for useful life, remaining useful life, and current replacement cost. And note that a remaining useful life of 0 indicates the component needs replacement in the initial year. And because something is located on this list, you know it's an asset that the association is responsible to maintain with a limited, predictable life expectancy above a minimum threshold cost. Remember that a reserve component list for a small association will then have a different makeup than one for a large association, because some components that are significant to a small association may be under the level of reserve significance to a large association. A large association may do some of those projects just as part of the ongoing operational budget. So let's turn our attention to the next agenda item. Which components most significantly influence your reserve fund strength and reserve funding computations? While a typical reserve component list may contain 20 to 50 items, not all those reserve components are equally influential. You need to know which ones are the important ones. Some are big, some are small, and it makes a lot of difference. You need to spend time with the significant items and not be too bothered about the small items. So, take a moment to ponder this question. How many components do you think typically drive a reserve study? Set in your mind? The answer is typically 5 or less. It's a wonderfully small number. Often the number is only 2 or 3. And you can look at it from another point of view. Even though a reserve component list may have 30, 40, or 50 components, don't worry about being overwhelmed with such a long list. Most of those components don't affect your reserve fund strength or the size of your reserve contributions very much. Most are individually insignificant. A long component list is necessary for completeness and for planning. Remember the scope and schedule. But typically the details about replacing a pool heater or the mailboxes or the garage gate individually have almost no effect on your reserve fund. This makes it easier to focus your efforts on working with a reserve study. You can focus your time and interest on those components that are influential. The picture in your mind that I want to paint is that of an aircraft carrier. There's lots of boats and ships in the ocean, but an aircraft carrier is one that instantly demands your attention. Its power and influence makes it worthy of your attention more than any other ship. And similarly, there's a few types of components that just by name should warrant your attention. The dominant components vary depending on association type and region of the country, but for typical townhome associations, the dominant components are roofing, painting, and asphalt. Period. In cooler or moist climates, you can add siding and window replacements. In mid or high-rise associations, you typically don't have as much asphalt or roofing, but you do have major interior hallway projects and major mechanical projects such as HVAC systems, air conditioning systems, boilers, elevators, fire alarms, things like that. Most components are window dressing compared to the few dominant components at your association. So now you know which components belong. It's that 4-part test. And of those components, which ones are the most influential. Everyone with me so far? We've identified, hands raised if you are understanding that it's a 4-part test and that some components are significantly more influential than the others. Great. Thanks all. Hands down. So we'll get on to the reserve component list. The reserve component list is the first of 3 reserve study results. As I mentioned before, the reserve component list defines the scope and schedule of your reserve projects. The second reserve study result is a computation of the strength of the reserve fund. This computation answers the question if the association has enough reserves, and if not, what kind of trouble are they in? Reserve fund strength is typically reported in terms of percent funded. If a large association with 500 units has a weak reserve fund at 23% funded, and a small little 10-unit association also has a weak reserve fund at 23% funded, they both have the same problems paying for their reserve projects. They will have a completely different amount of cash in their reserve fund, but if they have the same percent funded, they'll both be experiencing the same reserve issues at their association. And this is because percent funded is a comparison of the association's actual reserve cash to the current deteriorated value of the reserve components, kind of like how well this suit fits or doesn't fit the needs of this guy. 100% funded is when there's a good match, when current reserve cash is equal to the current reserve deterioration. Not total replacement, just the current deterioration. Percent funded gives you a reliable annual measurement in your reserve study how well the association's actual reserves compare to the deterioration of the common area assets there at the association. And the third result of a reserve study is what's most commonly thought of as the reserve study result. That's the recommended contribution rate or funding plan. All too often the first 2 results are completely ignored as the reader jumps to the recommended contribution rate. The recommended contributions for the initial year come from, again, per National Reserve Study standards, an evaluation of at least 20 years of upcoming reserve expenses. These recommended contributions for the initial year typically take the form of a monthly recommended reserve contribution. And as I mentioned a moment ago, this is the only of the 3 reserve study results that is a recommendation for action. The other 2 are just disclosures. The action the board takes here will affect the amount of cash in reserves, which of course will affect the size and strength of the reserve fund, which of course influences the association's ability to repair or replace reserve components in future years, which then defines the funding needs of the association, and around the cycle goes. All 3 reserve study results are interrelated, but it all starts with the reserve component list. Now I can transition to the final topic of the webinar. These are the, final topic of the webinar. There's 3 types of reserve studies. The way the reserve component list is compiled or updated forms the difference between the 3 types of reserve studies. Now these types are often called levels of service. There's 3 types of reserve studies. All are reserve studies. Every reserve study has a current reserve component list, calculation of reserve fund strength, and a recommended contribution rate, the 3 results that we've been speaking about. The way these 3 types of reserve studies differ is in the way the reserve component list is compiled. In a full reserve study, the reserve component list is created from scratch on the basis of a diligent visual on-site inspection. All the assets are measured and identified. Serial numbers, model numbers, square footage, whatever, and the reserve component list is assembled. Now, unless an association is growing or experiences some major changes due to reconstruction or some other significant event, an association should only ever need 1 full reserve study. Once we've measured the asphalt on the roof, you don't need to hire someone else or spend the time to remeasure the same components and come up with the same results. In an update with site visit reserve study, the status of every component is updated on the basis of that same diligent visual on-site inspection. But since quantities already exist, this is a less time-consuming effort, which means a less expensive effort than a full reserve study if you're working with a professional. The general makeup of the component list usually remains intact, but of course values for useful life, remaining useful life, and the current replacement cost are reevaluated and adjusted as necessary on the basis of what is seen on site. An update with site visit is a great way to get a periodic reevaluation of the condition of your reserve components, and many states require this level of reserve study every few years. And finally, in an update no site visit reserve study, the reserve component list is updated on the basis of time that's elapsed since the last reserve study and correspondence or interviews with people knowledgeable with the association. This may be vendors or board members or residents. This is the least expensive and least time-consuming of the three reserve study types, but is a very effective way to update your reserve study in the years between a more significant update with site visit project. An association can cost-effectively get a fresh, updated reserve study this way in years when not much has happened. As with a building, it all starts with the foundation. Now you know how a reserve component list is compiled. It's that four-part test. What type of information is gathered, which components are significant, and how the reserve component list fits into the three overall results. I also went on to explain how the reserve component list is compiled and how it's different in the three different types of reserve studies. But how do you use what you've learned today to point your association towards a more successful future? Well, you build it on the foundation of a reserve component list that's been well crafted based on National Reserve Study Standard concepts. The second key is to make sure it's updated annually. You can't make good decisions or accurate disclosures with outdated information. Reserve issues are simply too significant to responsibly ignore for years at a time. Remember that both the component list and your reserve balance get outdated every year. An update doesn't have to be a huge ordeal. A no-site visit update is a simple and effective way to get your association updated reserve study information every year in between a more significant update with site visit project. So what do you do now? You can tackle it yourself. I've laid out the concepts for you. It's not too big a cost or challenge if you have the right background and the right software tool. But obviously, we'd like to be of assistance to you if you'd like professional help. From our network of 10 offices across the country, we offer all three professional reserve study levels of service. Full reserve studies for those of you who've never had a formal reserve study, an update with site visit, or an update no site visit reserve study for those of you in need of an annual update. What's important is that your reserve study gets updated and that it gets done well. And that concludes my formal remarks on the subject. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I trust it's been a good investment of your time. As I indicated earlier, we've got an opportunity to handle questions at the end here if you type them into the questions dialog box. I hope you'll join us for other webinars like the Reserve Studies 102 program that we run if you're interested in learning more about percent funded and reserve contributions. And we have another session called Reserve Studies 103 if you'd like to see me bust some myths about reserve contribution calculation methods. And based on the time, I think we have a few moments where we can answer some of the questions you've already typed in, and I will turn the floor back to Chris and have her coordinate the questions. Chris, back to you.